Barron Trump had always been taught that true strength didn't just lie in wealth or power. It was found in kindness and understanding too. So, when he saw a homeless man sitting on a worn-out bench, hunched over a tattered Bible, something within him urged him to stop. The streets of Washington, D.C., were alive with movement as the afternoon sun cast golden hues across the city. Tourists strolled by, capturing photos of historic landmarks, while business people hurried past, phones pressed to their ears. Amid all this motion, Barron found himself pausing, his eyes drawn to a man who seemed lost in another world, a world held together by the fragile pages of an old Bible. The man's clothes were layered, most likely for warmth, though each piece was frayed at the edges. His hair, streaked with silver, was unkempt, yet his eyes, despite their weariness, carried a certain depth, a story left untold. He didn't seem to notice the crowd passing by, his attention fixed entirely on the sacred words before him. It wasn't the first time Barron had seen a homeless person in the city, but something about this man, about the reverence in his posture as he read, made Barron stop in his tracks. Barron had just come from a quiet afternoon walk, having slipped away from the ever-present security that always shadowed him. He understood why they were there, of course, but sometimes he longed for solitude, to experience life outside the confines of his name. And now, standing in front of the man with the Bible, he felt this was one of those rare, real moments he yearned for. Taking a step closer, he watched as the man's fingers traced the lines of text, his lips moving in silence. There was a certain peace about him, despite the stark reality of his situation. Barron hesitated, then finally spoke. "Excuse me, sir. What are you reading?" The man looked up, startled by the unexpected attention, but his surprise quickly softened into a warm smile. "The Book of Job," he answered, his voice deep and steady. "It's always been my favorite." Barron nodded, intrigued. "Why Job?" The man chuckled, shifting slightly as he straightened his back. "Because Job lost everything and... Yet, he still held on to his faith. He questioned, he suffered, but he never let go. And in the end, God restored him. It gives me hope." That one word, hope, lingered between them, heavy yet somehow comforting. Barron found himself lowering onto the bench beside the man, much to the dismay of his security detail watching from a distance. He knew they wouldn't interfere unless absolutely necessary, but he could also sense their unease. They never liked him getting too close to strangers. For now, he ignored them. "I'm Barron," he said, extending his hand. The man looked at him, his eyes narrowing slightly as recognition dawned. But instead of the usual reaction, either exaggerated excitement or forced politeness, this man simply shook his hand. "Daniel," he said warmly. "Nice to meet you, Barron." Barron relaxed. He appreciated that Daniel didn't immediately mention his last name or his family. That was rare. Most people saw him as a name first, a person second. But Daniel... He saw him as he was, a young man with questions, curiosities, and a heart eager to understand the world. After a moment, Barron asked, "What's your story, Daniel?" He truly wanted to know. Daniel sighed, his gaze drifting into the distance. "It's a long one, son." Barron didn't hesitate. "I've got time." Daniel studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right then," he said. "I used to be a teacher, English literature. Loved it with all my heart." Barron leaned in slightly, his curiosity piqued. "What happened?" Daniel let out a slow breath. "Life happened. Lost my wife to cancer. My son. He was in an accident. Drunk driver." He paused, his voice growing softer. "When I lost them, I lost myself too. Couldn't keep up with work. Lost my home. And well, here I am, Barron felt a lump form in his throat. He had never known such loss, but he could feel the weight of it in Daniel's words. And yet, here he was, still holding on to faith, still finding solace in the words of Job. "I'm sorry," Barron said softly. Daniel smiled, though the pain behind it was unmistakable. "Don't be, son. Pain teaches us. Just like Job, I keep holding on." Barron sat in silence for a moment, deep in thought. Then, his gaze fell on the Bible resting in Daniel's lap. Its pages were thin, some torn, others barely clinging to the spine. It had clearly been read over and over, yet it was falling apart. An idea formed in Barron's mind, but for now he kept it to himself. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small bill and handing. Barron handed it to Daniel, but Daniel shook his head. "I appreciate it, son, but I don't need money." Barron hesitated. Then, "What do you need?" Daniel chuckled, patting the Bible resting in his lap. "Everything I need is right here." Barron smiled but didn't argue. He knew, though, that there was something more he could do, something that truly mattered, and he was determined to do it. Barron Trump couldn't shake his conversation with Daniel from his mind. The way the man spoke about loss and faith stirred something deep inside him. That night, as he sat in his room, gazing out at the bright city lights, he thought about how unpredictable life could be, how, in an instant, everything could change, everything could be taken away. He had always known privilege, comfort, and security. But Daniel... He had known suffering, yet still found strength in his faith. That was something Barron wanted to understand. The next morning, Barron made a decision. He picked up the phone and called his assistant. "I need a favor," he said. "Find me the best, most beautiful Bible you can. Leather-bound, gold-edged pages. The kind that lasts for generations." His assistant hesitated for a moment before responding. "Of course, Barron. Any particular version?" Barron thought for a moment. "The same one Daniel has. Find out what version he reads, and get that exact one." It took only a few hours before a package arrived at the house. Carefully, Barron unwrapped it, running his fingers over the smooth leather cover. The pages were crisp, their golden edges gleaming under the soft light of his room. This wasn't just a book. It was a message, a gift, and maybe, just maybe, a new beginning for someone who had lost so much. With the Bible wrapped securely in a bag, Barron set out toward the park where he had met Daniel. His security detail followed at a distance, always watching. But Barron had made it clear. He wanted to approach Daniel alone. When he arrived, the old man was right where he had been before, sitting on the same bench, Bible in hand, reading with the same quiet reverence. "Daniel," Barron greeted, taking a seat beside him once again. Daniel looked up, his weathered face breaking into a warm smile. "Barron, good to see you again, son. I brought something for you," Barron said, carefully placing the wrapped Bible in Daniel's lap. "Open it." Daniel's hands, rough from years of hardship, trembled slightly as he peeled back. As Daniel peeled back the paper and caught sight of what lay beneath, his breath hitched. His fingers traced over the soft leather, his eyes welling up with tears. "This is..." Daniel's voice cracked. He looked up at Barron, overwhelmed. "This is too much." Barron shook his head. "No, it's not. You've carried that old Bible for so long, it's falling apart. You deserve one that lasts, one that holds your faith just as strongly as you do." Daniel swallowed hard, wiping at his eyes. "You have no idea what this means to me." Barron smiled, warmth spreading in his chest. "I think I do." Daniel let out a soft chuckle, still in disbelief, as he flipped through the crisp pages. "It's beautiful," he whispered. "Truly beautiful." For a while, they just sat in silence, the noise of the city fading into the background. Barron had never felt such a deep connection with a stranger before. Yet, in Daniel, he saw something he had never seen in the powerful figures he had met: humility, wisdom, and a quiet strength. A strength that didn't come from status, but from something much deeper. "You're a good kid, Barron," Daniel finally said. "Not because you did this for me, but because you see people. You don't just look. You truly see." Barron shrugged. "I don't know if that's true. I just think we should all pay more attention to others." Daniel nodded. "Most don't." Barron knew he was right. The world was full of people who walked by without noticing, who assumed things about others without ever taking the time to listen. He didn't want to be one of those people. He wanted to understand, to make a difference, even in the smallest way. "Tell me more about Job," Barron said after a moment. "You said his story gives you hope." Daniel smiled. Job was tested. He lost everything: his family, his wealth, even his health. He questioned, he doubted, but he never let go completely, and in the end, his faith was rewarded. He was given back more than he lost. Barron listened intently, absorbing every word. "So, you think that could happen to you?" Daniel exhaled, his gaze lifting toward the sky. "I don't know if I'll ever get back everything I lost, Barron. But faith isn't about guarantees. It's about trust. Trusting that even in suffering, there's a purpose." Barron nodded slowly. "I like that." Daniel chuckled. "You're a thinker, aren't you?" "I guess so," Barron admitted. "But I don't have it all figured out." "None of us do," Daniel said with a knowing smile. "And that's okay." They sat there a while longer, talking about life, about faith, about the unexpected turns both had taken. Barron found himself opening up in a way he rarely did, sharing thoughts he usually kept to himself. In turn, Daniel shared stories from his past, weaving wisdom into every word. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Barron knew he had to leave. But he also knew this wasn't the end. Not for Daniel. Not for their conversations. And not for the way this moment had shifted something deep inside him. "I'll see you again, Daniel," Barron said as he stood. Daniel smiled, holding the new Bible close to his chest. "I'll be here, son." Barron walked away, his heart lighter than it had been in a long time. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just a fleeting encounter. It was the start of something much greater. "It's safe." Barron glanced around. The shelter was doing its best, but it was obvious. They needed more resources. The dining hall was packed, and the beds he had seen earlier were cramped together. Maria and her team worked tirelessly, but it was clear they were stretched thin. An idea began to take shape in his mind. "What if we did something to help?" Barron asked. "Not just for you, but for everyone here?" Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "Son, I appreciate the thought, but shelters like this have been struggling for years. One person can't change that overnight." Barron didn't argue. Instead, he nodded slowly. "Maybe not overnight, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try." Daniel studied him for a long moment before a small smile crossed his face. "You remind me of my son," he said quietly. "He always believed in doing what he could, no matter how small." A lump formed in Barron's throat, but he pushed past it. "Then let's do something together." Daniel hesitated, but then he nodded. "All right, Barron. Let's see what we can do." Over the next few days, Barron couldn't stop thinking about his conversation with Daniel. The old man's words stayed with him, pushing him to think beyond just a single act of kindness. He knew he had the means to help, but the real question was, how could he make a lasting impact? Throwing money at the problem and walking away wasn't what he wanted. He needed to understand, to truly grasp what people like Daniel went through every single day. One evening, Barron sat in his room with a notebook in hand, scribbling down ideas. He researched shelters, food distribution programs, job placement initiatives, even transitional housing projects. The more he read, the clearer it became. Homelessness wasn't a simple issue. It was a tangled web of economic, social, and personal struggles. Many of these people had once led stable lives, only to find themselves one step away from losing everything. Determined to take action, he reached out to Maria, the director of the shelter where Daniel had been staying. But this time, he didn't just want to visit, he wanted to volunteer. Maria was pleasantly surprised, but quickly agreed. "Most people just donate," she said. "But if you want to be here, to really understand, that means something." The next morning, Barron arrived at the shelter, dressed in jeans and a simple sweatshirt, ready to work. His security team stayed outside, giving him the space he had asked for. Maria handed him an apron and led him into the kitchen, where volunteers were already preparing breakfast. The air smelled of fresh bread and coffee, the sounds of quiet conversations filling the room. "You'll be on serving duty today," she said, handing him a tray. A tray of fresh fruit. It's a great way to meet people. Barron took his place in the serving line, and soon, residents began trickling in. Some recognized him, whispering among themselves, but most just nodded politely, grateful for the warm meal in front of them. When Daniel made his way through the line, he chuckled. "Didn't think I'd see you behind the counter, son." Barron grinned. "Figured I'd see what it's like from your side." Daniel took his tray, found a seat, and watched as Barron worked. After the last person had been served, Barron grabbed a plate for himself and joined Daniel at the table. "Not bad for your first time," Daniel remarked, taking a bite of his eggs. Barron chuckled. "I think I messed up the portions a few times, but I'll get the hang of it." Daniel nodded. "It's good you're here. Not many would bother." Barron took a deep breath. "I want to do more, Daniel. I've been thinking, how do I actually help? Not just for today, but long term." Daniel set his fork down, leaning forward. "That's good, son. But let me give you some advice. People like us, we don't just need handouts. We need opportunities. A way to get back on our feet." Barron listened carefully, absorbing every word. "Like jobs. Jobs. Skills. A sense of purpose," Daniel said. "A roof over your head is a blessing, but without a way forward, it's just a temporary fix. We need a way out, not just a way to get by." Barron thought about that for a long moment. He had been so focused on immediate needs, food, shelter, clothing, that he hadn't considered the bigger picture. He needed to go beyond charity. He needed to create real change. That night, Barron started making calls. He reached out to business leaders, non-profits, and job training centers, determined to understand what programs already existed and where the gaps were. What he learned was both promising and frustrating. There were programs out there, but many were underfunded or lacked the right connections to place people in stable jobs. Over the next few weeks, Barron spent as much time as he could at the shelter, listening to stories, learning about the struggles people faced, and speaking with staff about ways to bridge the gaps. He started small. Reaching out to local businesses, he asked if they'd be willing to offer apprenticeships or training programs. Some immediately agreed, eager to be part of a solution. Others were hesitant, But Barron's determination was infectious. Word started spreading, and soon people were taking notice, not because of his name, but because of what he was trying to do. Daniel, ever the skeptic, watched with a mix of amusement and admiration. "You're really doing this?" he asked one day, shaking his head. "Didn't think you'd stick around." Barron smiled. "Neither did some of the people I reached out to. But I wanted to see this through." Daniel nodded slowly. "Then let's make sure we do it right." Together, they began identifying people at the shelter who were ready to work but needed help getting there. Some lacked skills, while others just needed a second chance. Barron reached out to training centers, offering to cover tuition costs for a few promising individuals. He partnered with local businesses willing to take a chance on someone rebuilding their life. The first success story came from a man named Luis, a former mechanic who had lost his job and spiraled into homelessness after a series of misfortunes. With Barron's help, he enrolled in a refresher course and landed a job at an auto repair shop. When he got his first paycheck, he walked into the shelter beaming, holding it up like a trophy. Barron watched the moment unfold, feeling something unexpected: pride, not in himself, but in the people taking these opportunities and turning them into something real. "This is just the start," Daniel said, standing beside him. "Yeah, it is," Barron replied. Barron had never imagined how much his life would change in just a few weeks. What had begun as a simple conversation with Daniel had grown into something far bigger. His project had evolved from an idea into an initiative with real impact. He had connected with business leaders, arranged apprenticeships, and even started discussions with policymakers about sustainable solutions to homelessness. But despite the progress, Barron knew there was still so much to be done. One afternoon, he returned to the shelter, eager to see how things were developing. He found Daniel in his usual spot, sipping a cup of coffee as he watched the activity in the dining hall. When Barron sat down beside him, Daniel smirked. "You've been busy, kid." Barron chuckled. "So have you. Maria told me you've been mentoring some of the guys here." Daniel shrugged. "They just need someone to listen. Someone to remind them that they still matter." Barron nodded. "That's why I wanted to talk to you. I think we can do more." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "More? I've been talking to a few people about a transitional housing program," Barron explained. "Not just a temporary shelter, but real apartments. Somewhere stable, where people can live while they get back on their feet. With job support, counseling." Daniel leaned back, considering it. "That's a big step." "I know," Barron admitted. "But I've got people willing to help. Investors, donors, even city officials. They just needed someone to push the idea forward." Daniel exhaled slowly. "And that someone is you?" Barron nodded. "With you." Daniel laughed, shaking his head. "Never thought I'd be working on something like this. With someone like you." Barron grinned. "Neither did I." A few weeks later, the first major breakthrough happened. A property owner, who had been following Barron's work, offered a vacant building to be converted into transitional housing. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Barron wasted no time rallying volunteers, transforming the building into something livable, something welcoming. One afternoon, Daniel stood beside him, watching workers paint walls and repair floors. "This is real," he murmured. "It is," Barron said. "And it's only the beginning." Daniel looked at him, something unreadable in his expression. "You know, Barron, I think you were meant to do this." Barron smiled. "Maybe. But I couldn't have done it without you." Daniel chuckled. "I think you would have figured it out." Opening day of the housing program was filled with emotion. Several former shelter residents, now employed, now ready to take the next step, moved into their new homes. Among them was Luis, the mechanic. He shook Barron's hand firmly. "You changed my life," he said. Barron shook his head. "You did that yourself. I just helped open a door." Daniel watched the scene unfold, his eyes glistening with pride. "You did good, kid." Barron turned to him. "We did good." As the sun set, Barron felt something deep in his chest, a sense of fulfillment. What had started as a chance meeting had changed not just Daniel's life, but his own. He had found purpose in the most unexpected place, and in doing so, he had learned something important. Real strength wasn't in wealth. It wasn't in power. It was in the ability to lift others up. Daniel patted him on the back. "So, what's next?" Barron smiled. "We keep going."